So much, everyone, for coming. And thank you to INSTITUTO for giving me this opportunity. And I hope you enjoy the talk. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about the work I've been doing in South Africa. It's really work that started from the time I studied architecture at Wits University in Johannesburg. And I started studying architecture at a time when there weren't many African people in the school. And I started studying in a university that had a legacy that's connected to apartheid. I'm sure all of you know about apartheid. And my work really was about how to interact with post-apartheid South Africa and what does it mean to have architecture within the context of a post-apartheid South Africa. Okay, so I'll do an introduction and I'll give you a rationale of what my work is about, the question that I'm asking. Let me give them a second. Great. Yeah, the question, the research question, I'm a researcher and academic at university. My PhD was done at the school as well. And I teach various courses, master's courses in architecture, as well as undergraduate, and supervise PhDs and master's students as well. So my work is really research. I'll explain the theory, the background, and the influences of my work, and then I'll go into my practice, how it translates into architecture, and eventually how we are now translating this into the trophy. So the rationale of the work is really based on this. This is architecture currently in South Africa, what people aspire to, and what people see as, the sort of thing that is at the apex of architecture. And so my question is really around this and trying to respond to this. So the aim of my practice is to respond to architecture in South Africa with a particular focus on cultural identity. And the question is, how may architecture in a post-colonial, post-apartheid South Africa be African in its identity? And I put African in inverted commas purposefully, and you'll see why. So the theory that I have been drawing on has a lot to do with theories of change and cognition and how people change their perception of the world. And this is based on my PhD. At the time, I was asking the question, how have people survived climate change in the past? And it turned out that ritual had a lot to do with it. And this is about the process of changing people's behavior and perceptions of the world so that they can adapt. So that was one aspect of theory that I've been drawing on. And the second is from post-colonial theory. So this is more about how do people change politically. So the one is how do people change psychologically? The other is how do people change politically? And I drew a lot on Frantz Fanon and post-colonial theory. But one recent place where I've drawn on theoretically is someone called Gayatri Spivak, who coined the term strategic essentialism, which is basically her studying women and looking at the way in which at the time Indian women were suffering from the kind of patriarchy that they were experiencing. And she wanted to find out how can we respond to this. But the problem was she didn't, she wanted to respond to this by having some way of creating a group of these people, which is in a way, homogenizing them or creating some kind of, some kind of heterogeneous idea of women. And she said we need to use a strategic essentialism. So basically, in the time in which we're creating a revolution, we have to strategically essentialize them, to group them in some way, to mobilize them towards liberation or whatever ends. And so this is a theory that I've applied in my work recently, and I'll explain why also a little bit later. So just in terms of my background, I come from the Northern Cape province of South Africa. I grew up in what's called a favela. But in this picture, I didn't want to show the favela. I wanted to show what's going on inside my house where I grew up. So that's me holding the phone, and that's my mother who's holding me. But what's important also about this picture, so you don't see the favela, you don't see the chaos outside. You see this thing that we were trying to create on the inside of the home. The guy who's got the photograph on the TV, that's my father. And the reason why he couldn't make it to my birthday is because he was in prison. So that's him now coming out of prison. This was Valentine's Day in 1990 when Mandela and everyone else came out of prison. So he was a political prisoner during the time when I was a small child. And he was arrested for terrorism during the apartheid regime because him and his comrades basically were saboteurs. They sabotaged various apartheid infrastructure in South Africa. And so I grew up in a house of political consciousness from a very young age. My parents were talking about the various things that were important at the time politically. I'm saying this and I'm showing this because the subsequent images I'm going to show you are of other influences that I have been critiqued are white men. In South Africa, sort of being seen to have some kind of romantic relationship with white men like Pancho Guedes, who I will present just now, seems counter-revolutionary, so to speak. And so I always have to present where my political consciousness started. Didn't start with people like Pancho Guedes. But anyway, so this is the school where I eventually went to study architecture. It's called the Witwatersrand University, the School of Architecture and Planning. And it's a very famous architecture school, the oldest architecture school on the African continent. It has had many people who have been part of this school. And one iconic person who was here was Pancho Guedes. And Pancho Guedes is a Portuguese architect, Portuguese Mozambican. His parents moved from Portugal to Mozambique as part of a colonial mission, really. His father was taken there to go and do whatever work as part of the colony. And so Pancho grew up in Mozambique and he developed his love for architecture there and eventually became the head of the school for 20 years. But this is before my time. One of the people who influenced me when I was there is this man. His name is Peter Rich. And so Peter Rich is a student of Pancho Guedes and also worked with him. So Peter was a lecturer at the school as well. And so what's important about them, Peter and Pancho, is that they were some of the first people to say, after apartheid ends, in what way will we create architecture that's much more responsive to the local context and the local culture in South Africa? Because as you all know, even today, architecture in South Africa is fundamentally European. The buildings, the spaces, the cities still look like European cities, except they've got favelas, which, we don't really see much. I don't know, maybe they are here in Porto. I haven't seen them, but the point is we have very European cities still in South Africa. And so these guys were asking, after apartheid, what new vision could we have for architecture? So this is Pancho Guedes, if you don't know him. And his architecture practice was between art and architecture. And he, was said to be influenced by surrealist art, But he was incredibly creative, productive, idiosyncratic. But what he said to Peter Rich is that Peter Rich needs to go and look at the indigenous architecture of South Africa, specifically a group of people called the Ndebele people, which are a group of uh, like an ethnic group, kind of a modern ethnic group that live in the northeastern parts of South Africa. This is Pancho's work at the school being exhibited. This again is before my time, before I even arrived there. And so when I first saw this work as a young Black South African, it felt like these people are doing something that is, they are experimenting with what could be. Everything else that I was seeing at the time, everything that I was being taught had nothing to do with the possibility of what it could be, what things could be. This is the kind of sculptures that he would do. So he's got lots of work that's similar to this. Probably the most influential piece of architecture of his for me was this building. It's in Maputo, in Mozambique. It's called the Smiling Lion. And for me, when I first saw this building, and what was really important was it was a symbol of a possible future for Africa. Of course, he used a lot of motifs. Some people even say it's pastiche. I don't know what the word for pastiche is. It's pastiche, yeah. Many people critique it. They say it's pastiche. He was very concerned about form and the way it looks, etc., etc. But for me, it was very important because everything else that we were being taught in the school had nothing to do with any kind of vision or inspiration towards something that belongs to African people. And so here you can see the relationship between Pancho's work and that of the Ndebele. I mean, recently I've been thinking about this a lot more, that, if you look at the Smiling Lion, he was somehow interested in the profile of the building. And he's done this in several other buildings of his, the silhouette. And when you look at the Ndebele, these walls also have this profile, apart from the fact that he painted on the building and also had that sort of influence of the motif. That silhouette and thinking about the profile seems to also be something that he drew into his work. So for me, this was very important. Think about being in a country. I always say this to Paulo. Think about being in a country where it's meant to be your home, but when you look around, there's absolutely nothing that says this is your home. It's like being in Portugal. Forgive me for these examples. It's like being here in Porto, but the whole architecture, everything, the food, the culture is all from Mumbai, India. Absolutely nothing from this place has anything to do with, you and your heritage as somebody who's from Porto. That's what it's like being in South Africa and living in South Africa as an African. And so this man's work really inspired me to say, what could we do? How could we achieve an alternative? And so my practice, since I started with my PhD, I looked to what Pancho was doing. So he was making sculptures. He was interacting with sculptors. He was, very prolific in the ways in which he was making things. So these are objects that I would make, trying to kind of have a dialogue with the type of work that he was doing. I would do a lot of paintings and drawings. These are paintings and drawings that I have done over the years. Again, not with any sort of clear direction. We were talking about how those filmmakers also just sort of start doing things without any clear direction, really just drawing on my inspiration from Pancho and Peter Rich. And so these are the sketches and drawings. And my work is using multiple media, different types of media. And some of the sketches and drawings that I would do would come from the narratives and stories from home, because as much as apartheid may have destroyed, a lot of the physical artifacts, and some of them are in British museums here in Europe, and one can only access them through archives. They are already mediated by archives. So in other words, even if you did have access to them, the interpretation, the way they're mediated is by colonial archivists. And so I would collect stories and narratives from the indigenous people from my community and use those to generate images and drawings as a way of trying to find an architecture. And then again, in the spirit of Pancho and his surrealism and his experimentation and his freedom, converting those into these kind of, my own idiosyncratic interpretations of these. So this is one of the drawings again. And now this has been exhibited in the same space that Pancho Guedes' work I showed earlier was exhibited in the school. And so translating this into architecture. Now, this is where things started becoming problematic. So this is a competition that myself and Peter Rich tried to enter. We came out fourth. It was a competition in the US, a place called Mobile, Alabama. And the brief of the competition was to design something called Africa Town. Okay, what does that even mean, right? Africa Town. And, I've done interviews with Peter Rich about this project, and I asked him, are you not essentializing Africa? Is this not like a caricature of Africa? And, he doesn't believe that. He sees this as an authentic expression of what is African. That's him and myself and my son. My responsibility in the project was to do what was called the Afrofuture Center, or something that was aspirational, talking about what the future of Africans. So Mobile, Alabama, the last slave ship that brought people from Africa and ended up in Mobile, Alabama. So it was illegal. It was much later after the slave trade was abolished. And so these people in Mobile still have a connection to the continent. So they wanted to create an architecture that is, helping them feel at home in Mobile. So it was about, my project was about trying to project into the future. So again, I drew on these, these idiosyncratic ideas and forms that came from looking and observing at Pancho's work over the years, and also studying a lot of my own people. So I came up with this idea of sort of exhibition space of African buildings or African huts or African structures. Again, almost to play on this essentialization. So these were just further images connected to that. And then more recently, I've been doing a lot of experimentation using AI. And so in this particular one, I started with an image of an indigenous San. So these are First Nation people living in the Northern Cape province of South Africa, where I'm from. And, as the image progresses, I basically convert what she's wearing into something that's starting to become architectural. And these images are basically, if you take that process with the AI and project it all the way, that's what ultimately comes out. And these were just further iterations of that. And then here I was trying to think about the same thing, but, converting it into sort of urban context. And then we did an exhibition of this work. And the whole aim of the exhibition was to bring, we did a film, and the whole aim was to bring people and say, what could the future of our cities be in Africa? Do we have a way of converting our cities to become more reflective of our identity as African people? Because, as I said, they're currently not. And there was a lot of debate and a lot of dialogue. And of course, the thing that kept coming up is pastiche. It's all about the visual. It's all about form. Surely there must be more to that than the pastiche. And really what we designed was kind of like a cave like space at the Venice Biennale, where some of these, concepts and indigenous ideas of space and architecture were expressed. Here, for instance, one of the co-curators wanted to express the way in which African spaces can be manifest, even if they're in these sort of sterile forms, but the spatial principles can still persist. So they don't have to be mud huts and thatch. And then I did these same drawings that I showed earlier to create this kind of cave-like space. And the final thing I want to show you in relation to that was last year we relaunched the Architecture South Africa Journal. Now, this journal traditionally was very normative. It was what you'd expect an architecture journal from anywhere to be. It had been edited by the same man for many years, since before I even started studying. So it's probably well over 20 years. And so when I was asked to take over the journal, the whole idea was to really visually change the feeling of this journal. And one of the key strategies was to put images of people on the front of the journal. It's like, I don't know, a big taboo in architecture to do something like that. But the purpose of doing this was because by having buildings on the cover, it perpetuated this thing of hiding the face of the people who are designing. Because if you were to put faces on all the previous issues of the journal, you would see it was basically white men who were being published in these journals. And so this is the way the journal looked, being deliberate about making it radically different from what was there before. And a very important thing that we did in the end was to have a big launch for this journal. Something, again, that's just never done in architecture in South Africa. We invited many people, young people came, African people, many young African people came, and it felt like something different. It felt like, there could be a new way of doing architecture or a new culture of architecture in South Africa. Now, what has come out for me from all of this work, what's really important is that this thing of pastiche, which is the critique I've had of my work, the critique that some people have had with Pancho's work. At first, it seemed like a very important critique, and I accepted that. But I began to realize that actually this thing of pastiche is very important, because had the work of Pancho not been expressive in that way, say for instance, his work was incredibly subtle and he was looking at drawing on African spaces inspired by the way thresholds worked or whatever the case may be, without this very overt facade expression, I would have not seen that there could be an alternative. And I realized that it's not enough to say that we're going to transform the South African landscape in these subtle manners, or at least in South Africa, because of how extreme the visual and spatial colonization is. The fact that even till today, whoever has been to South Africa will know that it is, you could be in Cape Town, you could be anywhere in Europe. It is very overt. And so I realized that to me, it's very important that whatever is done is equally overt. In fact, it needs to be louder than whatever is happening currently there. And so I developed this concept I'm calling hyper-essentialism. And I'm using Beatrice Spivak, who, used essentialism strategically for whatever the purposes were in her case. And in this case, I'm basically saying that I want to increase the pastiche. I want to increase the essentialism so that, like I said, with a journal, for instance, there is this clear, overt difference between whatever was there in the past. If I made the journal similar to what it was in the past or just continued it, maybe I'm saying I'm changing the content. I don't know if there would have been the same kind of reaction and motivation as there was from various people in the architecture community in South Africa who have in the past never felt like they're included in the culture of architecture. And so that's really where the strategy is going for me. It's hyper-essentialization. So whoever didn't like the essentialization in the past is definitely going to hate what I'm doing now. And so this has been the motivation for this trophy, to both commemorate and think about Pancho and what he's done in South Africa, because, love him or hate him, the fact that he's a man who came to South Africa due to colonization, to me, doesn't mean that there isn't value in what he brought, because had it not been for him, people like myself and others who then suddenly dreamt of an alternative may have not. Okay, so him and Peter Rich and a couple of others who are all white men did something that opened up a dialogue, whereas there may have not been that dialogue in the first place. So I am not seeing him, I've been critiqued by others. There was a colleague of mine once who said, I'm worshiping white men, and I don't see that as a fair critique, because I believe that even, the most brutal of apartheid, politicians, some of them have written incredible books, and there are things that I can read from those books. So I don't believe in that. I don't believe that one should just throw it away. So this trophy to me is a homage to Pancho. And so, taking some of the work that I had been experimenting with in the past, the same way in which he made these idiosyncratic little architectural sculptures, I started doing something similar to that and trying to obviously play with this hyper-essentialism. So what is an African sculpture? There's no such a thing, right? Africa is a gigantic continent with many, many countries, but deliberately asking, what is an African sculpture? I don't know what happened. Okay. And so the process of, so we went to Artworks a couple of days ago, and we started the process of prototyping this object. So, as you can see, it is an incredibly essentialized object, and I bet for the rest of my career, I'm going to think about ways of even deepening this essentialization. How can one really make it even more, And I'm turning that object into a stamp. So underneath the trophy will be a stamp. And the idea is to stamp everything into being African. So you can see here, now this laptop is African because it's been stamped in that way. So in other words, playing with the surface, just like how Pancho was playing with the surface, here I'm playing with the surface and really, trying to push this idea of hyper-essentialization. So that's an African hut, it's African architecture. This is what some people really do believe that that's the case. And in fact, I want to print some of these T-shirts and see if people will buy them and wear them proudly, saying this is what an African hut looks like. I'm wearing African architecture. So here, for instance, it says, the African hut is one of the most ubiquitous structures on the African continent. And that's really, the kind of things that we're playing with. So these are African shoes because they've got zigzags, and the zigzag becomes this sort of, this um, almost caricature of what is African. And so the zigzag will be everywhere. Like here, for instance, this is an African shop because it's got these zigzags, and the storefront of the shop has become Africanized. And finally, going back to this building, the idea is now finally the building has become African because we have stamped the word African on it and we've given it these zigzags. And so, that's really what the concept behind this trophy is going to be. It's not necessarily, because every single film festival will be about Africa, but it's really trying to pay homage to what Pancho was doing. And for me, I think right now, this is an important step in opening up this conversation about what is African architecture today in the 21st century. That's it. Thank you. Just to say quickly, so these are other people who are doing the same kind of thing in South Africa. This is um, a fashion designer. His name is Maklosa. His name is Laduma. And you can see these are obviously European clothes, but he's put African prints on them, and now they're African. And that car there, it's an artist called Esther Mahlangu, and she's a very popular artist in South Africa today. She's an Ndebele woman, and she's, I call her work hyper-essentialism. People say, she's doing indigenous African architecture, art, but the Ndebele people are very heterogeneous. Obviously, not all of them do colorful paintings on cars or whatever the case may be, but she's an example of this hyper-essentialism. Down there, that's actually a picture that was taken very recently of one of the buildings that Peter Rich designed on the back of the phone of a young African student, because that young African student is seeing that as African architecture. Um, so anyway, that's what is happening today. And so just to illustrate that I'm not the only one who's thinking in this way.